Yeah, just hold on, head back.
You good? Stop. Oh, come on. Go. Jesus, 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 Jesus. Jesus, 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 Jesus.
You're going viral, bro. You are going viral.
I just farted. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus.
Janet just laughing at your back. Yo, Janet just cheating on the whole time. Hey, Jaya, mine's gonna be worse than yours. Mine's gonna be worse than yours. Mine's gonna be worse than yours. Alright, yeah, hold on, have that for me, alright? Yo, what's in your pocket right now? Your pocket?
Are you straight, man?
Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Jesus, Jesus. Jesus, Jesus,
Bro,
Jesus.
come on.
Jesus. 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 Thank you, God, for keeping me safe. Keep me and my friends safe, God. Using my praying, man. Thank you, God.
What you over there praying for, man?
Oh.